last week we had started with Joshua chapter 3 and 4. We read chapters 3 and 4, but we didn't actually get to chapter 4 to really discuss much of it. So I've got a couple of, and remember, of course, those of you who are online, that if you want to pin me using that little push pin when you hover over me, it should take that full screen. But I think that when I'm in presenting mode, it goes full screen anyway. Is that correct? Okay. So, and I will present some pages, but I'll take it off in a moment. But Joshua chapters 3 through 5, like I said, last week we discussed a little bit regarding Joshua chapter 3, and I have a couple of more comments that I would make regarding chapter 3 and a couple of comments regarding chapter 4 that I think are interesting and pertinent, and then we may get to chapter 5, but I'm not totally confident about that. I want to bring your attention to Joshua chapter 3, verse 5. Joshua chapter 3, verse 5 is a place where I would make a couple of comments, because I don't know that we got a chance to really address a couple of these issues from last week. It says in Joshua chapter 5 that Joshua said to the people, "Hallow yourselves, for tomorrow Yehovah will do wonders in your midst." Now, I know that we have discussed this previously, and I hope, remember that I was tired and exhausted last week. So if I have already covered this last week, someone pipe up and say, "You know what, Alan, you already talked about this." But you may be edified by it and just decide to just let me go. So we'll see what happens. But Joshua 3:5 is talking about them consecrating themselves, but it doesn't tell us exactly what that means. What it means to how they consecrated themselves. And my study kind of showed that what I am surmising and what a lot of Bible scholars guess is that them consecrating themselves looked a whole lot like it did when the children of Israel consecrated themselves as they were preparing to cross, not as they were preparing to cross the Red Sea, but as they were approaching Mount Sinai to hear the word of God. And Moses told them to, I think that they were told, do you remember what he told them? No? Anyone? If I remember correctly, God told Moses to tell them, or Moses told them to bathe themselves and wash their clothing and abstain from sexual intercourse. So, and I think we talked about that when we were studying that section of Scripture. And I remember there being some commentary about, why did he tell them to not engage in sexual activity prior to meeting with God? And that was not because sexuality is dirty or unclean in some way, but because that there is a period of ritual uncleanness that happens after the act. That is something that ritual bathing is required post coitus, as you will. Now, we assume, and modern scholarship assumes that a similar directive was issued here by Joshua as they are preparing to cross the Jordan River and go into the land of Canaan, that he would have said to them when he said, "Sanctify yourselves," that a similar series of instructions would have been given. And I don't think we have any reason to doubt that. But I wanted to kind of discuss briefly with you, number one, that this word hallow, if you look in your Hebrew text, is the Hebrew word kadash, from which we get the word kadosh, which is holy, sanctified, holy. It's the same kind of thing, from that same derivative of the Hebrew 6942, hit chadashu, in this case, that is to sanctify yourself. And the first mention of this word comes from Genesis 2, verse 3, which is the very first mention of holiness. And I know I'm getting a memory hole here. I feel like I've said this before, but maybe I have so many times that it doesn't, it's not what I'm thinking. What is happening in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, where the word holiness is mentioned for the first time? When God rested from his work of 6 days and rested on the seventh day, and he sanctified the seventh day and made it holy. So you know that when you come to a passage and you're looking up a Hebrew word, that it's always a great idea to look at where that word was used the first time, because that's highly instructive. The first time that a word is used, the context of that situation can give you insight and wisdom into what you will be, learning about in this, current situations that go after that one. So when you look at this, he says, sanctify yourselves. It really is holiness. And what we're talking about here, and I think that each of us recognizes this, because we've talked about it before, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment, is that there's not really any place in the Scripture that says that you have the ability to make yourself holy. There are a couple of iffy passages, for example, in the book of 1 Corinthians, where it talks about the unbelieving husband sanctifying the wife and the unbelieving wife sanctifying the husband. But I don't believe that that's a practical thing about, my wife is an unbeliever and she's made holy by me. I don't believe that is exactly what that's talking about. But what I think many of us, or most of us, recognize is that only God can declare something to be holy. And he has said, you are a holy people, and you shall be holy because I am holy. But that we don't have the ability to make ourselves holy. We only have the ability to, number one, which is what we see in both the passage regarding when the people approached Mount Sinai and what you see when the people are getting ready to cross the Jordan River, is that they are basically called to ritually cleanse themselves of ritual defilement. You're not going to make yourself holy by taking a bath. You're not going to make yourself holy by washing your clothes, and you're not going to make yourself holy by abstaining from sexual activity. That is about external holiness, which I would suggest can be a picture of a spiritual reality, but more than likely is a picture of ritual uncleanness that could have been contracted in multiple ways, but that God is concerned with both temporal, meaning in the flesh, holiness, where you can become defiled by touching a dead body. We basically saw this in the book of Leviticus when we were studying it, that ritual uncleanness is almost exclusively contracted by coming into contact or touching some aspect of death. And if you want to dig into that a little bit deeper, I definitely recommend that you take a look at that a little bit deeper. But that the idea of ritual uncleanness, anything that you can do from the book of Leviticus that will make you ritually unclean, means that you've had some brush with death. Not that you almost died, but that you came into contact with some element or aspect of death in some way and have become ritually unclean. So here we have, just like we had at Mount Sinai, Joshua telling the people to sanctify themselves. So they probably took a bath, washed their clothes, and probably abstained from sexual contact. Now, back to my presentation here, and I will share that screen again with you briefly because I want to point out just a couple of things. And that is, how do we sanctify ourselves? Well, I would suggest to you that it's exactly the same way. We temporally follow the ritual purity laws that take us right back to Acts chapter 15, which deal with sexual immorality, the foods that you eat, touching dead body, idolatry. We keep ourselves from becoming ritually unclean, defiling ourselves by steering clear of things that can contaminate us. Those can be physical things or sin. We know that sin contaminates us, but food contaminates us. Sexual immorality contaminates us. Dead things contaminate us. So we can defile ourselves temporally, and we can defile ourselves spiritually through sin. Now, if you look at the New Testament, and I put on my notes here that spiritually we are impotent, meaning we have no ability to make ourselves sanctified, holy. We really don't have that option. We can engage in holy behavior, which means doing what is right and not doing what is wrong, because if we do what is wrong, we will become ritually defiled. We will become unclean spiritually and perhaps ritually unclean physically as well. But we can't really do anything to sanctify ourselves spiritually. And I think, and this is nowhere illustrated more so than when you look up in the Greek what this word is translated to. And you'll see this word, Hagia, and you've probably heard the word Hagia, like Hagia Sophia. This is a church over in the Holy Land somewhere.
Istanbul.
What? Istanbul. It's in Istanbul. That's right. The word Hagia means holy. And there's some derivative of hagiazo. Hagiazo, I believe, is the Greek word that is translated as sanctification in the New Testament. And if you look at, and I did this when I was studying this week, that you can look up that word in the New Testament, hagatio, which means sanctification, and you'll see that it's used precisely 29 times in the New Testament. And in almost every single instance, it is talking about God sanctifying people. God sanctifying people. Not people sanctifying themselves or somebody sanctifying somebody else. And a really good example of that is in the book of John. This would be like a prime exemplar, if you will. And I'd like to take just a moment to take you to the book of John and see how Yeshua addresses this same issue in the book of John. So if you would, take a look at John chapter 17. John chapter 17 deals with this a little bit. And I would bring you to John chapter 17, starting at verse 16. I just want to read a couple of verses here. And this gives you a really clear picture of what it is to be sanctified. Who does it, and what does it mean? So here's what it says in John 17, verse 16. They are not of this world, just as I am not of this world. Talking about the disciples. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you have sent me into the world, I also have sent them into the world, and I sanctify myself for them, that they also may be sanctified by truth. Yeshua would be the only one who can sanctify himself, not us. But he is asking God to sanctify them. The book of 1 Peter also mentions this. Paul mentions this in a couple of his letters, that it is God's job to sanctify us, to make us holy. It is our job to keep ourselves unstained by the world, as James would say. This is pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God, to keep oneself unstained by the world. That means to follow his commands. And I think the reason that I am really kind of pushing this concept aggressively, and I do this a lot, but I personally really feel like in the days that we live in, there is nothing more important than your sanctification. Nothing could be more important than your sanctification. And I don't know what is going on out in the world, but some things are happening out in the world. The evil is increasing at an exponential rate. I don't know what it means. I don't know if the end is nigh. I'm not saying that it is, but I'm saying that, even people who I would consider to be very, very circumspect and almost never talk about end time stuff, because they just don't know, and they're not really involved in it. They're very much aware that we might be in end times, but they don't know when it is. Even people who are very, very circumspect in regards to end times have been saying openly something is going on. I don't know what it is, and they're not making predictions, and I certainly would be very, very leery about somebody who's making predictions. But a lot of people are sensing that spiritual darkness out there in the world. And us maintaining our sanctification in these days is so absolutely critical. And I think this is just so amazing too, that it always ties in very nicely with Hanukkah. If you're just going about the Jewish tradition and playing dreidels and eating potato latkes and eating chocolate coins and lighting candles as a replacement for Christmas, then you're missing the boat entirely. If you, however, are reading the book of the Maccabees, if you are examining the texts that surround the idea of dedication, this is called the Feast of Dedication. Hanukkah means dedication, and it is about dedicating yourself to God over and above the world and its ways. Then you're seeing, as you continue to research Hanukkah and how it's, at a deeper level, you're seeing a lot of this. There's so many amazing parallels with end times and Hanukkah and Antiochus Epiphanes and the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, and it's all tied together in such interesting ways. So I'm just harping on sanctification. Just steering clear of defiling yourselves by any means by which you might become defiled. And I think one of the biggest points that I would make is I'm going back to the book of Joshua when he says, sanctify yourselves. And you look at that first instance, and it says that the very first instance that this word was used was in Genesis 2:3, where God is sanctifying the Sabbath day. What does that tell you about one of the first steps about sanctification? What is one of the first steps about sanctification?
I would say obedience.
Obey the dang Torah. And you bring it down to a really practical level. Do not violate the Sabbath day. I have I have not been a person who has griped and picked and tried to be the Sabbath police or anything like that. You know that I am not really like that. I'm not one who's telling people how they should do things and stuff like that. But I am going to make a declarative statement that sanctification begins with holiness. It is the same thing as holiness. And if you are not observing the Sabbath day, you're violating your holiness right out of the gate. It's the first time that sanctification is mentioned in the Bible is in regards to the Sabbath day. And it's also interesting that there are readings that are kind of like assigned. It's informal, but readings are assigned to each of the 8 days of Hanukkah. And today, the second day of Hanukkah is related to holiness. It's related to holiness. And there are scriptures from from Leviticus chapter 11 all the way through the New Testament. Messianics have extrapolated that into the New Testament. And the theme for the day is, the theme for the second day of Hanukkah is holiness and maintaining one's holiness. And it's interesting to me that the second day of Hanukkah this year falls on the Sabbath day, the weekly Sabbath day. I think it's all very pertinent and very significant. So if you are not, I strongly encourage you to observe the Sabbath day. Now, what does that mean? I'm not going to tell you what that means. I'm not going to tell you what the rules for the Sabbath day are. Look into that for yourself. I'm not Sabbath police in that regard. I'm not going to tell you what you should and should not do on the Sabbath day. But observe the Sabbath day. It is the essence of holiness. It really is the starting gate of holiness. Sorry, I'm moving on. I'm jumping down from the soapbox, and I am moving forward. Now,
hey,
yes, ma'am.
What if?
Angela, I don't know if you guys hold on. Oh, she doesn't know if she wants you to hear this. Okay, hold on. Talk a little bit, Angela. If you can hear Angela talking, nod your head. Go ahead.
What if the way you spend your Sabbath is a prescription for how you spend the millennium, the 7,000, the seventh, day, that 7,000 years?
So
do you want to rest, or do you want to work for 1,000 years?
Okay, I don't know if you heard that. That's pretty funny. But no, that is an interesting idea. However you choose to use your Sabbath day now might dictate how you how you get used in the 7,000th millennium. That's an interesting idea. I think it may not be funny at all, but it struck me as funny at the moment. But that's an interesting concept. Anybody else have any comments, questions, or concerns about this?
Yes.
Gracie? Talk loud so that anybody can hear you.
In the Baptist type of Christianity. And we had communion once every, depending on which church we were in, periodically. And my folks always taught us kids, before we even go to church today, in fact, if sometimes the evening before, Daddy'd say, when you go to bed, you be talking to the Lord and ask Him to show you if there's something that makes you really unworthy in His sight, because Jesus has saved you. But if we're living in sin, then we're not in a right relationship with Him. So if you need to make something right, and if you don't find something, you're not looking hard enough.
That old wonderful Baptist guilt.
That's when I first got introduced to the verses from the Psalms with David saying, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts." I've skipped some. "And see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." I think that what we're talking about applies like you're applying it, but I think it applies more to every single day. And it's not that I can conjure up the holiness. It's that when I am really open to the Lord and really sincere, and He knows my heart better than I do, He's going to show me. And if He's not showing me anything, I'm not really paying attention, because I'm never going to be on this earth perfect.
I see what you're saying. Yes, yeah, asking God to search your heart and being really open to what He has to say. And if you're not hearing anything, it's because you're not really listening.
And it doesn't have
okay,
anything to do with the Ten Commandments.
yeah, no, I can agree with that.
Would be rubbing
I can agree with that because there's always need for improvement.
Yeah.
There's always need for improvement. And if you're able to look around at yourself and say, I'm doing pretty good, you've missed it. Clearly, you've missed it. Because each of us has ways in which we are struggling. I know, I don't know who's willing to admit it, but yeah.
Sometimes every time the first thing that comes back to mind is something He's been working on you for years.
Oh, yeah.
And you just keep slipping back into it.
That's a great point. Absolutely. Marie, did you want to say something?
Yes. Just a reminder, Exodus 31:13 tells us, speak also to the children of Israel, saying, surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. So keeping your Shabbat, I think, is a sign of the covenant that we continue on with our Lord and Savior.
I agree. Yeah, totally agree.
Right here in Exodus 31. So.
Yeah, and I think that there are, if I'm not mistaken, there are several of scriptures like that where it just talks about how the Sabbath, the observance of the Sabbath day, is a sign between God and His people. That's an interesting search to do in your Bible about what are these signs. I mean, circumcision is also described as a sign between God and His people. And I think that's a sign between you and Him personally, obviously. But the Sabbath day is a fairly open sign. When you're not willing to go out to a restaurant and purchase and buy and sell and go to these places and do those kinds of things, work on the Sabbath day, you really kind of stand out like a sore thumb. Marie?
Yeah, I was saying that Hebrews 4 verse 9 also say there remains a sabbatical rest for God's people. But most translations do not translate it like that. They just say rest. Mm-hmm. But if you go into the original Greek, it says sabbatical rest. Mm-hmm. I think it's Hebrews 4 verse 9.
Right.
And that's in the New Testament.
Yeah, absolutely. And, unfortunately, some interpreters, I don't want to say translators, but interpreters would look at that and say, well, Jesus is our rest. He observed the Sabbath day so that we don't have to. That's a bad theology, bad doctrine, to say Jesus was obedient so I don't have to be. That is not a good place to be. And anyone who thinks that way, I am going to go ahead and warn you sternly, do not put your trust in the fact that Jesus observed the Sabbath so that you don't have to. That's a bad idea. Jerry?
To me, one of the things about the Sabbath is that's God's signature. If you read down through it, says God created this, God did this, God. If you take all of that out of the command sets, well, that happened on a different day, or it doesn't exist anymore. And that's like saying, that's the devil saying God don't want you to know that God is the one that did all this. If you make a legal contract and you don't sign it, it's useless.
Yeah.
If you take God's signature out of the Ten Commandments, the rest of them are null and void.
That was His signature on creation.
Yeah, I think Jerry has got a good point, that God's signature upon creation is the Sabbath day. That's His distinct mark. And that just...
He said what you've done is good, now let's rest.
Absolutely. So, yeah, marking yourself in that way is really, really vital, I think. So, all excellent points, and I just think it's so critical in these days that we live in to do not defile yourselves and really trust in God to provide the sanctification through the Messiah Yeshua. You're not going to sanctify yourself by keeping the commandments. You're going to maintain your holiness by keeping the commandments and seeking forgiveness when you mess up, because you continuously will. I know I do. So, that's fantastic stuff. And I want to just point out another couple of things. If you look at Joshua chapter 3, verse 9, I just want to point this out in regards to in regards to this one more comment regarding chapter 3. In Joshua 3:9, I want to bring you there to just briefly discuss a little point. It says in Joshua 3:9, Joshua said to the children of Israel, "Come hither and hear the words of Jehovah your God." This is quite fascinating when you contrast, the crossing of the water that happened when they left Egypt at the Red Sea, where they're about to cross the water here at the Jordan River. It's interesting because the people were terrified when they saw the Egyptians bearing down on them, and they were panicking. And Moses said to them, "Be still and behold the salvation of God." And you compare that with what Joshua says here, "Come here and hear the words of Jehovah your God." Whereas Moses said, "Do not be afraid, stand still and see," or "behold the salvation of God." Joshua says, "Come here and hear the words of Jehovah your God." Now, I think that you're probably picking up what I'm putting down here. That we have, again, I mentioned this last week, where we're seeing a progression where the children of Israel are maturing a little bit. They're growing up from needing to see to being able to hear. And Joshua is directing them to come forward and hear the word of Jehovah, your God. Did you want to say something? Oh, okay. Interesting thing. Joshua says, as you continue in verse 10, "Hereby," Joshua said, "here is how you will know," or "hereby shall ye know, that the living God is in your midst, and that he will without fail destroy all your enemies." I've just skipped to the end of verse 10. "Behold, the ark of the covenant of Jehovah, the Lord of all of the earth, is going over before you. And now take 12 men out of the tribes of Israel, one man for each tribe." So when you go back to verse 10, and Joshua says, "Here is how you will know that the living God is in your midst." What is he talking about? What is the here? When he says, "Here is how you will know that the living God is in your midst," what is he talking about?
The ark in that river.
The ark in that river. Yes. The ark in that river is how they will know. But is he talking about, where have you heard that expression before? That's always something to ask yourself as you're studying, your Bible. Where have you heard that before? If you read something and you think about it and you go, where have I heard this? Where have I ever heard those exact words, or where have I heard something like that before? Does anybody have any idea about where something really similar to that has been said before? It's connected with the Exodus from Egypt. I'll give you that hint. Okay, fine, I'll tell you. Moses was told by God, "Here is how you will know what's going on. When you come to this mountain to worship, you will lead those people to this mountain." Now that was said some time before he even left Midian to go to Egypt. So God gave Moses a sign in the future.
In other words, he's telling him he's coming back to the place he left.
Right. He's telling Moses, here is the sign so that you will know that it's me who's doing this when you come back here with the children of Israel and worship God at this mountain. And I think something similar here is going on. Yes, you can definitely say, Joshua is saying, here is how you will know that the living God is in your midst, because he starts talking about the Ark of the Covenant, but what does he talk about right before he talks about the Ark of the Covenant? The enemies, the dispossession of the enemies. That's not going to happen for some time. They've got to cross that river. They got to start beating up on the Jerichoites. They got to beat up the people of Ai. They got to beat up all these people, the Hittites and the Amorites and the Jebusites and the Canaanites of all different types. We got a lot of ites that we need to defeat. So I think that Joshua is hearing the word of Yehovah in the similar way that Moses was, where he's saying, here's how you will know for sure. But it's not going to happen for some time. Yes, you're going to see some things where my power is working. There will be signposts along the way to build your faith, because I know that you still need your eyes. You're human. You don't have perfect faith. You need to see God working in your life a little bit at a time. But here is how you will know. Now you might say, well, Paul says something like this, faith, hope that is, why does someone hope for something that he already sees? Well, we hope for what we do not see. We have not yet seen the salvation of God coming to establish His kingdom. The Israelites and Moses had not yet seen God taking them to the mountain. It was coming soon. And I think that you might even say in this little section, you're seeing that lengthening of the prophetic. Whereas Moses was told, here's how you will know. I have every expectation that the time from between when God told him, here's how you will know, and when they actually made it to Mount Sinai was, well, how long would you guess? A year? 2 years? Maybe 3 years? Could be. We don't know exactly how long that period of time in Egypt was where all the plagues were happening. It could have been in 1 year, it could have been a couple. At least a year, yeah. It could have. Some scholars and Bible interpreters think it could have been a couple of years. So that's a fairly short period of time. How long is it going to be between this thing here where it says, here's how you will know, without fail he is going to dispossess all these people? That could have been a whole nother generation of people. So you might be seeing the lengthening of that prophetic utterance. Here's how you will know. For us today, here's how we will know when Yeshua comes to establish His kingdom.
And defeats the enemies.
And defeats the enemies.
This isn't done.
This defeating of the enemies, if you're looking at it from a prophetically foreshadowed picture, is not done yet. The real battle is about to begin sometime in the probably not too distant future. Monday. Jerry says Monday, the battle is coming. So I don't know, but I will say that prophetic lengthening is coming, and we have yet to see it. But there are signposts all along the way to offer us encouragement and to give us things to see. But remember, blessed is he who believes without seeing. Marie, tell it, girl.
No, that was me.
Oh, was that you, Wayne? Sorry.
You just stole my thunder. I was about to say, blessed are those that have not seen but believe.
We're on the same wavelength.
Yeah.
I have a lot to say about this, but we wouldn't leave here tonight. So, from what you poured out last week, you just opened a whole bunch of new stuff.
Well, you know, that's awesome. That's awesome, Marie. And, if you're not ready at this time to succinctly state your case, do it next time. But I love hearing from you because you've got good wisdom, and I appreciate it. But I hope that this is always spurring you spiritually to see things and look at things in a different light. That's the whole point of what we're doing here, is to dig a little deeper. So I really feel like this is, like I said when we first started this book of Joshua, it's really helpful to continuously inject into the text the idea that this is about Yeshua and it's about the end of the age, and it's all reflected in the longer, bigger picture. Now, it's generally speaking not a great idea to inject things into the text, but if you see something like a prophetic shadow picture and you continuously keep that in your mind, just be on the lookout, because there are amazing things that can be gleaned from that text. any other comments, questions, or concerns about anything in Joshua chapter 3? Because I'm planning to jump forward a little bit into chapter 4. Angela, you go, girl.
I think verse 16 is important.
Verse 16, she believes, is important. You don't say. Now, let me just read for you verse 16. The waters which flowed down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far by Adam, the city that is beside Zaratan. And those that flowed down towards the sea of the plain, the salt sea, were completely cut off. And the people went over opposite to Jericho. Discuss, Angela.
This whole thing with when the ark gets in that water, the waters coming down from above go up, and they stand up like a big signal, a big tower. And I think that's important when you're thinking of it in Messianic terms, that ark is, that I think what's going on here is the crucifixion, resurrection. Waters coming down, cut off, and rise up. Because that word rise up is used. That's bad.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting. Can you? I like what you're saying, but I would like very much for you to elaborate just a little bit, because I think that needs a little bit more. Could you elaborate just a wee bit?
I just wanted to point out that verse because I think when you get to chapter 4 and that chiasm that we pointed out last week, I think that supports that idea of this is a monumental thing. This is the crux of the whole thing, is that ark in that river. So that his people can go over.
Well, but you mentioned a moment ago regarding how there was that you saw the waters piling up, and then the waters down being cut off was somehow a picture of the resurrection. Explain that a little bit more.
Because it says the waters coming down from above, and then they rise up. Because it uses those verbs.
And you're seeing the water coming down from above as a picture of Messiah Yeshua?
Well, if you think about from the Galilee to the Salt Sea, you have living water coming from the Galilee, water you can drink. By the time it gets to the Salt Sea, it's bitter. It's no longer, he cuts it off. And that living water comes down from above and rises up. Think about Yeshua being the living water coming down from above. He's cut off and he rises up. And that is what allows his people to pass over on dry land into his promised land and defeat their enemies. So that is like that's why I'm saying that is a summary for the whole thing.
Indeed. Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes, I dig it. That's a fascinating insight. What do you say about that, Wayne or Marie?
I'm in total agreement with Angela. I'm seeing it from a different perspective, of course. I see Jordan is the sender. The meaning of the word Jordan is the sender, and we descend into the Jordan just like our Messiah's descend. He descended twice. First, he got baptized by John the Baptist, and then in Ephesians 4 we hear about him descending. He ascended after he descended. So we, like him, descend in the Jordan, and our descending figuratively is humbling ourselves, dying to ourselves, like he did, die for us. And I see the same thing. And so when we cross over the Jordan, that's essentially we are going through. We're going through the humbling process. Basically descending, sort of like what Angelo just said. And again, with the stones, I see that the stones being removed from inside the bed of the river and taking it out, it's like we're creating a new creation for each tribe. So I see that's the whole, like she said, I think that's the whole picture that you see over and over there. The point of that whole Joshua 3 is Yeshua.
Mm-hmm.
But there are just so many things that are just pointing to the same thing, from different angles, different levels of the same thing.
Yep. Yeah, excellent. Excellent. Great observation. I totally agree. Yeah, that's a very fascinating word picture, and I hadn't considered it from that direction, but I think that's amazing for sure. Good insights. Anybody else want to throw something out there before we jump a little bit forward into chapter 4? Okay. If you look at chapter 4, verse 1, I want to point out verses 1 through 3, I believe. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 3 say, wait a minute. Yes, okay. Now, when all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, "Take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from each tribe, and command them, saying, Take up for yourselves 12 stones from here out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet are standing firm, and carry them over with you, and lay them down in the lodging place where you lodge tonight." So, I wanted to just touch on a couple of things. Just a couple of things, and these are not, I don't know, they're iffy, but something interesting happens in chapter 4, and it also happens in chapter 5, which I think that I think that what I'll do is I'll touch on this, but not go into depth, because I want to spend a little bit more time going into depth when we get to chapter 5 regarding this issue. But I will say that both here and especially in chapter 5, you see God's people, the Israelites, being referred to with 2 different terms. One is Am, and the other is Goy. Now, you probably know, if you've studied any little bit of Hebrew at all, what those 2 words mean, and who generally those 2 terms are a reference to. The people of God, Israel, the Israelites, are almost never referred to as Goy. Goy is, frankly, today is still used as a term that means Gentiles. But the people of God in both chapter 4 and 5 are referred to as Goy. There's something interesting there, and I'll talk about that when we get to chapter 5. If we get there tonight, then so be it. If not, I'll do it next time. But just make note of that fact, that it kind of switches back and forth between Am, the people, my people, and Goy. And when those terms are used is also very significant. Okay? So just hold on to that thought for a moment. And I'm going to move forward just a little bit in this same section to talk about these 12 stones. Now there are some scholars who believe that there's really only one set of 12 stones, but there are many other scholars who believe that there are actually 2 sets of 12 stones being discussed here in chapter 4. One set of 12 stones is taken from the bottom of the river by 12 leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel and are carried up out of the river bottom and are taken on the journey and are erected at Gilgal, where they establish their camp to set up as a memorial. But then there's a specific section that's a little bit further down where it says that Joshua In verse 9, it says, "And 12 stones did Joshua set up in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant had stood." So there's another set of stones, 12 of them, that Joshua sets up in the riverbed. Now, there's a couple of interesting things about that, and we can talk a little bit about the 12 stones that are taken from the river and brought to Gilgal, and the word Gilgal plays into that whole idea as well, and we'll deal with that in a moment or later. But the 12 stones that are erected in the Jordan River itself is certainly interesting. I mean, you think about this. What good would it do to take 12 stones from the river, which is obviously probably full of stones? Why would you erect 12 stones in the middle of the river? And what is the significance of these stones?
Israel was here.
Well, certainly it's a signpost. It's a memorial, and it's a sign. What's that?
But it's covered in water.
Is it though?
But it assumes that they stayed in place, so God must have kind of cemented it.
Yeah, it's certainly not likely that you would take 12 stones that are this size, that you can pick up by hand and arrange them in the river. No one's going to see them. Is that like, that's just? How is that a sign if no one can see it?
You're not supposed to.
Now, you're not supposed to see it? Why do you say that?
Because I think those stones are replacement stones for the 12 they took out and saved.
Kind of like a redemption price?
Those are the memorial, yes. The ones they took out are the memorial. They're the signpost. But then Joshua, who represents Yeshua, the people, the 12 tribes, each take a stone out. That's the men. The redemption happens when Yeshua or Joshua takes 12 and replaces.
So you see it as Joshua perhaps taking 12 stones that didn't used to be in the river and placed them there to replace the 12 stones that had been taken out.
It's a symbol for him taking the place in death under the water of his people, all of his people, all 12 tribes.
The 12 being the representative of all 12 tribes. No, that's a good idea. That's a good insight. I like that idea. Marie, go ahead.
We can't hear. We're not hearing. I don't know if anyone else is hearing, but I can't hear. I know Angela is saying something really good. And I can't hear.
Can anyone else nod? Were they able to hear Angela? No, not very well. Okay, so a couple of you are shaking your heads, no, we couldn't hear, and a couple of you are shaking your heads, yes, we could hear. Okay, so.
Not clear.
What's that?
We can hear her, but it's not clear.
I got you. Okay, yeah, come a little bit closer, Angela. No, and let me. I'll try to summarize it really quickly, and then she can fill in some gaps. She is suggesting that the 12 stones by the 12 tribes, one man from each tribe took 12 stones and took them out of the river bottom and to set up as a memorial at Gilgal, and that Joshua, quote unquote, Yeshua, took 12 stones and put them under the water as a kind of a symbol of death to represent almost like an atonement, a payment that was made for the 12 stones that are swapped. Taking the place of the 12 stones that were swapped. What would you add to that, Angela? That was basically it. Okay, I seem to have summarized it correctly. Does that help? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, I would bring to your attention just two ideas. And I'll kind of play off of what Angela said a moment ago, where she sees these 12 stones as being under the water. But I would suggest that you contemplate the idea that, number one, these stones were like, in my mind, there's perhaps an idea that these stones were not buried under the water, that they were large enough that even when the water is in flood stage.
How does Joshua carry a stone that big?
How does Joshua carry a stone that big? Okay, well, yes, it does say that he did it. It does say that he did it. Now, was he imbued with superhuman strength? Possibly.
Why do they have to show?
Why do they have to show? Well, they don't have to show, except that you got to remember this. Except when the Jordan River is in flood stage, it's like a trickle. There's not much there.
In flood stage?
No, in flood stage, when it's not in flood stage. No, I said when it's not in flood stage, there's not much there. It's very unimpressive. The water level goes down quite low. It's a very small river. It's like...
This is happening during flood stage.
This is happening during flood stage. And I would suggest that the possibility that while, yes, these stones may have been, they would need to be large enough to not just be, taken away with the water, right? They'd have to be big enough to just not be tumbled along and taken downstream.
Right down into the Dead Sea.
Okay, Angela. Yes, sir.
I don't know.
Are you saying that they're not on the bank of the river where people can see them all the time?
Well, we're talking about two separate sets of stones. One set taken to Gilgal, but this says that 12 stones Joshua set up in the midst of the Jordan. So if you look at that, it's in the middle of the Jordan River. So yes, I am suggesting it is not on the side, it's not on the shore, it's in the midst of the river. And I'm considering under what circumstances it is like baptism, yes. And yes, and I understand what Angela is saying, it's kind of like baptism, but I'm suggesting also that there's an interesting connection here that I would try to make. And that is, number one, that if these rocks are large enough, they would perhaps stick out a little bit of the water even when it was during flood stage. And then when the flood stage is over, that water goes down quite a bit and you might still be able to see them. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because something interesting happens in the very beginning of the book of Matthew when it says that John the Baptist is in the wilderness of Judea preaching that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And then it says that he goes to the Jordan and he's talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees who are coming to him for baptism. And he says, "Do not think that you can say to yourselves that Abraham is our father. God is able to raise up sons to Abraham from these stones." Now, what stones is John the Baptist talking about? I think it's possible that those stones, he was not talking about the stones at Gilgal. I think he was talking about the stones that were still piled up in the middle of the Jordan River. Now, if that's true, now that's pure speculation. But consider who he's talking to, who John is talking to, and what he's saying to them, and now consider what those stones that Joshua placed into the middle of the river as a picture of death might represent. Does that spur your imagination at all, Angela?
Yeah, because the 12...
Come closer, nobody can hear you.
Well,
You can't stand 20 feet away and expect...
I keep thinking off the cuff like
It's
this.
okay to think off the cuff.
Well, the
You got a
12
good brain that works.
The 12 that were taken out was a man from each tribe, and it makes very specific. It says that a couple times. It says that those were to represent the 12 tribes of the children of Israel.
Right.
So the 12 that were put in, if it's real specific about the ones that came out representing Israel, my first guess would be that the ones that were put in, if they had to be somebody besides Israel, would be somebody besides Israel.
Okay, well, what if they are not somebody besides Israel, but a certain aspect of the same group of people? Represented by the Sadducees and the Pharisees, who were the unbelieving and rebellious, who didn't cross over. They were stuck in the river. Stuck in the river, stuck in the water, buried under the water, staying there as a memorial to where 1,300 years later, John the Baptist is able to say, from these stones, God is able to raise up sons to Abraham. That could be taken in a couple of different ways. And I think there's interesting possibilities for thinking about that God is able to rescue and make alive again those who had been trapped by death under the water as a possibility, that he's pronouncing judgment on these unbelieving, unfaithful, unscrupulous stones who were going to stay in the water. I don't know exactly what the answer to this question is or how to look at this exactly. I'm simply bringing to your attention that there's something interesting happening with these stones in the water. I don't know exactly what it is, but it works. It bears digging a little bit deeper. Jimbo.
Yeah, there's the other 12 stones that are on the breastplate of the high priest.
Yeah, that's true too.
And those represent the 12 tribes.
And what did Angela say?
Those represent the 12 tribes.
Those represent the 12 tribes, yes. I think that's common understanding. In fact, I think that it says that those stones are actually inscribed with the names of the tribes of Israel. Yeah, absolutely. So that's interesting. Anything else?
Yeah. Also, when they came and John saw them, John said to them, "Who warned you of the wrath to come through the vipers?" So I know there's something there.
Yeah, the offspring of a serpent is some seriously loaded language. He's calling them children of the devil.
Yeah.
Now, is that hyperbole? It certainly could be, but that's very harsh. He doesn't mince words, that John the Baptist, and that's probably why that Herod cut off his head. He got tired of listening to him rail against him, married his sister's wife. But no, there's some very fascinating and deep and significant things going on in that symbolism. I don't know exactly what it is because it's hard to. There's a lot of speculation, but it's fun and interesting to speculate because I know that there's some deeper spiritual things there, and you got to be led by the Spirit of God and making connections and seeing what you can find. But it's certainly interesting. So thank you for entertaining my idea on that. Now, and I think what I'll do is I'll start to wrap up here with this final observation, and we'll save chapter 5 for the next time. And that is that it shows that the priests took the Ark of the Covenant and went into the water, and the water stopped. And then the people all passed over, and then the priests came out of the water. So they were first in and last out. Now, that preaches itself, if you know what I mean. This to me suggests strongly that God is so faithful to get in there, to provide the salvation, to provide the path to victory, the path to entering into His kingdom, and He is standing there the whole time while all of the people. How long did it take for 2, 3, 4 million people to cross the Jordan River? Probably a while. Okay, so these priests with that ark are standing in that riverbed the whole time until the last straggler is making it across the Jordan River. The sick, the elderly, the weak, the frail, they did not move until every single person made it across that river. And only then did the priests move out. And even after probably Joshua established his 12 stones. So that to me suggests strongly that you're talking about the incredible faithfulness and patience and forbearance of God to hang in there and hold open the way of escape until the very last person comes in. And I think there's a strong correlation to today, and I know that you're aware of this, that picture in your mind Yeshua with the rod and the staff of a shepherd hooking the necks of every one of his lost sheep. There's going to come a time when the last of the lost sheep is roped around the neck and is pulled across the river, so to speak. And it is at that time that Joshua, is going to step out of that stream. And that river is going to come down hard and heavy. I mean, can you imagine? Yeah. So can you imagine after that water upstream 1,000 yards has been building up? Consider that the waters building up upstream might be representative of the wrath of God. How long did that water pile up? How high did it go? How wide did it go? And when it finally cut loose, I'm guessing that Joshua said to the people, stand back way away from this river, because when the priests come up out of this water, it's going to flood something fierce. It's going to seriously overflow its banks until it comes back to normal. So, yes?
I didn't mean to cut. Did I cut off your thought?
No. You're good.
Yeah, what you're just saying about being first in and last out, that Yeshua is always there. It's similar to in Revelation with the seven churches, the seven lampstands, which we believe those represent believers in different levels of their journey. And he says that he's amongst them, amongst all those amongst the lampstands. So yeah, he's there no matter where you are in your walk, that he's still there with you.
Absolutely.
Waiting patiently.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that as a total picture of him waiting patiently for us to overcome and make it across that river. And he's going to wait in that river until the very last stragglers make it across that stream on dry ground. And then the wrath of God is going to come down, and all that water that's been piling up is going to come crashing down. But the people are going to be safe. Marie?
Any significance about passing on the dry land as opposed to it keeps on. We noticed that in when he passed the Red Sea, the same thing happened. Mm-hmm. It was always dry land. Any thoughts?
Yes.
Angela? Alan?
Angela, yes, come closer. Angela has a couple of comments.
If you think back to day 2 of creation, that's when he separated the waters above from the waters below. And he created the dry ground, and that was a place for man to live. So that's like, you think of that as a safe harbor. That's where we live, on that dry ground.
Excellent insight.
Life.
Yeah, excellent. Very good. Very good. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got just a possibly different take on it. You know how in Joseph, the story of Joseph and his brothers, we see that he gave a double portion to Benjamin, and a lot of Messianics believe that Benjamin is indicative of Messianic Jews.
I've heard that, yes.
What if the 12 stones that are in the water are significant of Israel, who've come to faith in Messiah and are bathed in the water of the Spirit? Is that far out?
It's definitely different. I don't know that it's far out. Now, you would suggest that those stones are indicative of Messianic Jews who are bathed in the water of the Spirit?
It's just a thought.
No, I understand. I don't have a problem with that necessarily. There's a lot of different ways to look at these metaphors. I mean, Yeshua could teach a parable about one thing, and then, a couple chapters later teach a different parable about the same subject, but seems to be slightly contradictory. There's different ways to look at and we're all talking in parables when we're comparing something to something else. We're using allegory to do so, and it can be interpreted in multiple different ways. if you just apply those metaphors and kind of play it out, tease it out, the metaphor breaks down at some point, but there's different ways to look at these things, and a lot of them make sense in different ways. So I'd say that's not insignificant, Jimbo. Now, I know that Mike last time, and this is the last thing that I will say, in verse 19 of chapter 4, it talked about how the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th of the first month and camped at Gilgal on the eastern edge of Jericho. Now, we know that is the day that is referenced in Exodus chapter 12, where it's talking about on the 10th day of the month, each house is to take a lamb and get it ready, doing the examination of the lamb. I frankly don't know exactly what to do with this. Marie does, however, know what to do with this, and we're going to see what she has to say.
You tell me to be succinct, so I'll try to be.
Yes.
And that date was the date, as we know, given for you to find the unblemished lamb. And because they're crossing over on this day, you think that maybe that's when the crossing over will occur. But usually when feast days are when events are rehearsed. But the 10th day of the first month is not an event. You're told to do something on that day. So I don't believe that they're crossing over on that day. I believe that it's pointing, again, to the second or later believers. When each person individually recognize their unblemished lamb, Yeshua when he returns, and first when they recognize it, then they're allowed to cross over. There's a huge back story to get there, where I'm getting right now, but basically I'm seeing that because I'm not sure if you know this, but in Mark, when Yeshua came in on the donkey, it was also the 10th day of the first month. If you go through Mark, and go through the days, you'll realize that what we call Palm Sunday was the 10th day of the first month. Mm-hmm. So Yeshua was around for a while before a lot of people recognized who he was, until he came in on a donkey. So this date, the 10th day of the first month, is basically saying, as the second believers individually start seeing Yeshua, then they're allowed to pass over. Because Scripture is really revealing that these later believers who see Yeshua when he comes back and start believing in him, they're allowed in the land just on the premise of recognizing that he's the Messiah. We have to go through the new creation process. We go through and we abstain from certain things, and of course we are made holy, and we make it into the land. Like I was saying to you some time ago about the difference between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven. Mm-hmm. Kingdom of God, you have to become a new creation and be reborn of the Spirit and water. For you to get into the kingdom of heaven, your righteousness has to bypass the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. And the scribes and Pharisees did not accept Yeshua as the Messiah. So these people, just accepting Yeshua as the Messiah, are able to cross into the land. Then they go through their new creation process. That's why they went to Gilgal to get the circumcision of the heart. So the process for these second believers are different from us. We're going through everything now and being sanctified, and then we'll eventually get the glorified, incorruptible body when Yeshua returns, because we recognize that the first time. The second believers just need to recognize that Yeshua is the unblemished lamb, recognize him, they pass over, and then they start their sanctification process in the land.
Okay.
I'm trying to make it as succinct as possible.
No, I understand.
But that's as best I could get it.
Okay. No, I think that's certainly an interesting insight. And I was just looking at it from, the perspective of how it's mentioned in Exodus chapter 12, where it's not a feast day. It's not even a part of the Passover. It's just a kind of a prelude to the Passover, where you're supposed to inspect this lamb for, 3 or 4 days so that it can be sacrificed on the 14th. So you got... Yeah, so you inspect that lamb for a short period of time, and I think you mentioned that it was on the 10th of the month that Yeshua came into Jerusalem just before his crucifixion on Palm Sunday, is what traditional Christianity calls Palm Sunday, and that I think Michael Rood, if I'm not mistaken, mentioned about how Yeshua, or maybe it wasn't Michael Rood, I don't know if it was someone, said Yeshua. If you notice what happens to Yeshua when he gets to Jerusalem riding on a donkey, the Pharisees and the scribes and the elders interrogated him for 3 or 4 days just prior to his arrest and crucifixion. He was being examined as an unblemished lamb.
Wasn't that when he said they stole it and rise up and shout hallelujah?
Yes, because the people said, "Shut your disciples up," because they're creating a stink, and he says, "If I tell them to shut up, the stones will sing out." Now, that's an interesting connection, Jerry, because I don't know about how that connects to this crossing of the Jordan, but it's interesting that Yeshua said these stones will cry out. Maybe he might be so there might be a connection to the stones in the Jordan River. I don't know why it says, it's never for no reason that the Bible tells you a specific date when it does so. It's for some reason. I don't know exactly why. I mean, I know Marie has her idea about, this is a prophetic thing, but I think there's a little bit more to it than that too.